Carl Sagan, the famed astronomer and host of the hit show Cosmos, who passed away in 1996, often argued that ancient hunter-gatherers were scientists. What they lacked in modern tools and methods, he claimed, they made up for in their mindset. He wrote in The Demon-Haunted World, a book I devoured as a newly minted atheist teenager in the 90s. The footprints of a fast-moving animal display a more elongated symmetry. A slightly lame animal favors the afflicted foot, puts less weight on it, and leaves a fainter imprint. A heavier animal leaves a deeper and broader hollow. The correlation functions are in the heads of the hunters. For Sagan, science was about inferring something you can't see from what you can. Impressionable teenage me had no reason to doubt Sagan's pronouncement. In a reversal of the story of Adam and Eve, our fall was not a turning away from God, but a turning away from rationalism. Sagan supposes that because many hunter-gatherers have little to say about the supernatural, the natural state of human beings is clear-headed atheistic rationalism. Pre-Enlightenment civilization was to blame for introducing gods, including the God of the Bible, and replacing our scientific minds with superstition. I'm no longer an atheist, but I am a scientist, and Sagan and others who continue to argue the noble rationalism of our hunter-gatherer ancestors are wrong. What Sagan depicts is not science, it is mastery, and mastery is not the same as science. Mastery is grounded in empiricism, while science is grounded in theory. These are very different things. I came to recognize this truth recently after finishing shop class's Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work by Matthew B. Crawford, a best-selling 2009 book on the value of mastery in tradecraft. Crawford's father was a professional physicist, and Crawford himself majored in physics before pursuing a doctorate in political philosophy. After only 5 months working as director of the George C. Marshall Institute in Washington, D.C., he quit to start a motorcycle repair shop in a sketchy part of Richmond, Virginia. In the book, Crawford, a perpetual gearhead, recounts an encounter with his father that crystallized in his mind the difference between tradecraft and science. One day, I came into the house filthy, frustrated, and reeking of gasoline. My dad looked up from his chair and said to me out of the blue, "Did you know you can always untie a shoelace just by pulling on one end, even if it's in a double knot?" I didn't really know what to do with this information. It seemed to be coming from a different universe than the one I was grappling with. Thinking about that posited shoelace now, it occurs to me maybe you can and maybe you can't untie it in a stroke. It depends. If the shoelace is rough and spongy and the knot is tight, it will be a lot harder to undo than if the knot is loose and the shoelace is made of something slick and incompressible, like silk ribbon. The shoelace might well break before it comes undone. He was speaking of a mathematical string, which is an idealized shoelace. Science is primarily concerned with extracting ideals from a messy reality. It is fundamentally rooted in the Platonic world where Crawford's father's shoelace, spherical cows, and other such ideals live. Thus, it is rooted not in human mastery, which Sagan wanted to believe, but in Western thought beginning with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who laid the foundation for thinking about the world in terms of idealized laws. The merger of Greek thought with messy reality, however, came even later in the early modern era with the experiments of Galileo, Kepler, Robert Hooke, and Robert Boyle, and of course, Isaac Newton. All these men had mastery over their instruments, such as telescopes, prisms, lenses, and scales. They understood, however, that by applying the philosophy of the Greeks, it is possible, by observing the motion of an object, a planet, a spring, a weight, a pendulum, or some liquid, to infer the existence of universal laws. Such laws do not exist within the messiness of human tradecraft, where heuristics, that is, rules of thumb, rule. When tracking an animal, fixing a motorcycle engine, or baking bread, universal ideals are as useful to the master hunter, mechanic, or baker as the ideal shoelace is to someone with a stubborn knot. Thanks to the science developed in the last 400 years, we can not only understand how to untie shoelaces, an example of mastery, but model it using the laws of physics so that we understand precisely why and under what circumstances we can and cannot untie them. Concepts like momentum, friction, tension, and so on were invented to idealize the real world, and in so doing, help us understand why the heuristics of the masters work. But before that, there was little that we could call science, and none outside the Western world. and those civilizations it influenced. Now let us look at China. China has been, since the beginnings of civilization there about 7,000 years ago, highly technological. There we find heuristic knowledge forming over millennia, such as the four great inventions: gunpowder, papermaking, the compass, and printing. Yet, the Chinese did not have the underlying philosophy that would turn these heuristics into science. Even their philosophers regretted the lack of a theoretical basis for their science, as Joseph Needham writes. In the 13th century, however, some minds were becoming very dissatisfied with the mainly empirical methods on which the science of surveying had been based. In his two books, Shi Ku Chat Chi Suan Fei and Suan Fei Thung Pian Pen Mo, both of about 1275, Yang Hui strongly criticized Li Shunfeng and Liu Sust, who had been content to use methods without working out their theoretical origin or principle. The men of old, he said, changed the name of their methods from problem to problem, so that as no specific explanation was given, there is no way of telling their theoretical origin or basis. This was an extremely modern attitude. It was then, in the 13th century in China, but even more so in Europe, as dissatisfaction with the empirical methods of the ancients based on mastery grew, that we see the beginnings of what would later become science, not before. It is no surprise that, as Needham says, many translations of Euclid were made into Chinese in the 13th century, transmitting the Western ideals built into Greek geometry to the East. Indeed, Needham, 1900-1995, a British biochemist and sinologist, student of China, posed this question throughout his life, such that it became known as the Needham Question. The question, partly the basis of his multi-volume masterwork on the subject, Science and Civilization in China, from which I quoted above, is this: why did the West overtake China in science and technology when China had such a long head start? As Needham wrote, why did modern science, the mathematization of hypotheses about nature, with all its implications for advanced technology, take its meteoric rise only in the West at the time of Galileo? Continuation focusing on Galileo's time. Needham argued that while China's science grew steadily over time, Europe's scientific and technological revolution in the Renaissance was so explosive that it simply overtook it. That explosive growth occurred because of the mathematization of hypotheses, and this was something which was never achieved in China before the 19th century. And why did this occur? It came down to the convergence of two technologies, the movable type printing press and the alphabet. While the Chinese had movable type printing long before Europeans, their language precluded the easy production of books at a rapid pace. European books, by contrast, needed only a few dozen characters at most, could be printed in Latin, which was the lingua franca of science for centuries, and disseminated to all learned people. Printing, along with dissemination, allowed the creation of something new, a kind of early internet that connected scientists together and enabled them to share ideas rapidly, on the order of months rather than years or decades. There are other explanations as well, such as China's totalitarian control and centralized hierarchy, which may have stifled innovation. Because that is still a feature of Chinese politics today, it is often a focus of those who wish to show that China cannot overtake the United States in science or technology. I'm not so sure. There is nothing uniquely exceptional about Westerners that enables us to develop science and technology at breakneck speed. Rather, it is the convergence of many factors: Greek philosophy, a common language with Latin, the printing press, and even the fragmented nature of European states, which enabled competition. None of those are a unique advantage to Westerners now. Even Europe is no longer as fragmented as it once was, thanks to the EU. The critical ingredient to the growth of science, however, remains available to all, but perilously easy to lose: free exchange of ideas. That is why government or corporate or professional association or university suppression of science and scientists to support a particular ideology has always had disastrous results. Both those on the left and the right have been guilty. With the growth of government funding for science after World War II, it has become even easier for politicians to attach strings to money for science. Yet, professional societies, accrediting agencies, university administration and corporations all get in on the act, using what leverage they have to achieve their ideological ends. While one might suggest that China is surely far more guilty of this than we are, since it is essentially a dictatorship, I'm not so sure, especially looking back at the last 10 years or so. Perhaps we are still doing better than China, but not better than we were in past decades. Whether China overtakes the West in science and technology will come down not to keeping the demon-haunted world at bay, as Sagan believed, but rather to protecting those values that made Western society what it is today. These are the values of classical liberalism, upon which much of post-Enlightenment Europe and America was founded, which are in peril today. The reasons why are a subject for another article. Suffice it to say that what is exceptional about the West is not its people or its land, but the culture and values those people practice, and have practiced, not always well but consistently improving, until the present day. And I believe that it is those values, more than any kind of self-identification as a Westerner, that matter the most.